feet?
Yeah.
We are rolling.
Yeah.
Hey everybody, how's it going?
Pretty
good. Good.
Yeah.
All right, so I've been tasked with 25 minutes of talking about music theory, which is an odd amount of time to talk about something as deep as music theory. So I've been thinking all day and all week about what I wanted to do and came to some conclusions. The first one being that in my time working at the jazz, with the students at the Jazz Colony, one thing I've noticed is that in terms of musical theory, pretty much every student I've encountered here is at a different level of understanding in terms of where they're coming from, what they've studied with their private teacher, where they are. So that led me to the conclusion that if I kind of went through the classic lecture of, go up 3 semitones for the minor third and all that kind of stuff, that I would be boring half of you, losing half of you, and I might just reach like 1 or 2 of you total. So I decided not to do that. What I would like to do today is a couple of things. I'd like to first just kind of go through a progression, like a checklist of things that you can look at and assess yourself on and determine how you're doing at these different levels of, quote, musical theory understanding, and kind of gauge your progression. So it's just a couple of steps. It's like 4 or 5 steps of things that you can kind of say, do I really understand that concept all the way? Can I really play these things cleanly and without thinking about it, basically, as a way to kind of place yourself in a spot where you can then progress forward. I also have this cool little handout I'd like to talk about. I'd hopefully like to take some questions. I'm not sure if there will be any questions, but with something like such a broad topic as music theory, questions are honestly probably the best way to go about this, because everyone's going to have different things that they're wondering about. Literally every single person is going to have different stuff. So I would like to open up a couple minutes for questions as well. I'd like to first begin, though, with a little bit of context. So when we talk about music theory in a jazz context, I want to make it really clear that we're talking about a very, very small subsection of the larger world of music theory. And I think that this often gets passed over in jazz education circles. This idea that when we talk about theory, we're talking about what notes are in the chords, things like what scales go with chords, and how chords fit into keys. And the fact is, if you were to go online and look up music theory information, right, or order a textbook on music theory, you would find that these topics are actually an extremely small percentage of what the larger field is about. And that when we talk about music theory in this context, what we're really talking about is practical jazz music theory most of the time. So information that helps you play pop and jazz music, right? And these topics generally fall into a couple categories, like determining what notes are in chords, right? How to interpret the language of chord symbols is probably the most important part of it for a lot of students. And then later on, chord scales and things like that, which I actually don't really like very much. But mostly it has to do with interpreting the language of chord symbols, right? And you guys are dealing with this every day, whether you're a rhythm section player or a soloist, you're looking at these chord symbols and having to determine what to do with them or how to interpret, right? So what I'd like to do is go through things that you can practice and ways to practice them so that you don't get too far ahead and start thinking that what you're practicing isn't really helping, and also that so you don't skip over any of the smaller details. Cool? So I'm going to make a list for you guys up here on the board and kind of talk about each one as we go. So the first thing that I think is really important that often I found with my students oddly kind of tends to get skipped over, particularly in situations like this, is intervals. Just intervals. And when I say intervals, does anybody like to tell me their interpretation of what I mean when I say intervals? Say learning intervals.
The distance between 2 pitches.
The distance between 2 pitches. Could you describe what you mean by the distance between 2 pitches?
So, well, if we were talking about like A and B, the interval between that could be
So you're getting a little specific right now. Yeah, but when we talk about intervals and the distance between two pitches, basically let me just demonstrate it like this for those of you who are like, what do you mean by the distance between two pitches? What I mean by that is, I'll just demonstrate it like this. If we have one pitch, moving up to another pitch, we have that distance, and then we have this distance. The first distance would be said to have been larger than the previous distance. Does that make sense? So we have large distance, smaller distance. Cool? Now there are specific names for every possible distance between any two notes. The system that is used to name these intervals is significantly more complex than I have time to describe right now. However, the resources for you to learn the system are definitely available to you on the internet. In fact, every single thing that I talk about today, you can learn more efficiently by just Googling. I'm absolutely 100% not sugarcoating that at all. You can, if you want to know how to spell musical intervals, just go to Google and type, how do I spell musical intervals? And you will get good information. It is such a widely taught and widely understood topic that the likelihood of you getting bad information is super, super low. Cool? So the very first thing is intervals. And what I mean by that, what I mean by intervals is simply this. If you think of one note, one pitch on your instrument or on a staff or just generally abstractly E flat 3, right? The goal is to be able to measure the distance up or down from that note to any other note extremely quickly. And ideally, over time, you would get to the point where you don't have to think about it at all. If you just think about two notes, then your goal is like a second, it's like a result of thinking of those two pitches simultaneously. And I think a lot of people who've gone through this process would agree that if I said something like D, F sharp, your brain just goes to third. You just think major third, right? It's like a result of having done it enough times. And that's going to be a central thing of what I'm talking about today is this idea of through repetition getting to the point where you don't actually think about it anymore. But for now, I actually have what did I do? I actually have this handout that I'd like to give you guys that I found to be really helpful for practicing your intervals. You guys want one? Cool. I got this from a teacher who I highly respect, this guy named Randy Halberstadt, who of all the local, actually you guys can just pass this around, I'm going to grab it too, but just pass that around. Of all the local music teachers I've interacted with, Randy's one that I highly respect. Let me just show you how to use this, what it's intended for, a way that you guys can use it, and yeah, you can give it a shot. The Rings of Hell are pretty cool. This was actually developed not as a way to practice an instrument, but as a way to practice ear training. Given that this is a high school camp, I'm not going to ask us to sing all these. This isn't a choir camp, so I'm not going to ask us to sing these out loud. But with my ear training classes, the goal is we often will sing these. The way this works is they get progressively more difficult as you go through, but you can start anywhere on any of the circles. So let's say we started on the first. And actually, who has their instruments with them? We can just try one right now together. You guys have your instruments? Can we all just play a concert B flat together? And we can just try this. There it is. So the way these work is that you begin on anywhere on any of the circles. So let's start on the first circle, the one entitled number 1. And we'll start at the top. And you can move any direction around the circles too, but we're just going to go clockwise at first. So we'll start at the top, playing our B flat. You then move from B flat up a major third, which is the next indication clockwise on the circle. Do you guys see that M3 written there?
More copies.
This is all the copies we had. Like,
Yep, this one.
yeah, they're really cool actually. So you then go up a major third, a second, and you keep progressing around the circle. So after going up a major third from your first note, and I'm kind of rushing through this. If you're not familiar with the term major third right now, again, 25 minutes is absolutely not enough time for me to teach you what a major third is. I hate to say it. I wish it was. I could lecture on it, but it wouldn't stick. This is something you can actually do. If you get home and you're like, hey, let me try out these rings of hell, but I'm not really sure what these symbols mean. Again, it will take you 5 minutes. Google what are intervals, musical intervals, and all the information is right there. It really is. If you want a specific website, which you don't really need, but if you want a specific website, this is a pretty good one. musictheory.net, but chances are if you type in what are musical intervals, that's the first link that'll come up anyway, so you'll get there. So anyway, you'll start on your first note. It can be any note. Use B flat. Then move clockwise around the circle, go up a major third. For those of you who want to play along, we're going to go up a major third. Awesome, concert D. From there we'll move down a fifth, down a perfect fifth. That'll bring us down to concert G. From there we'll move down a major second. And then finally up a perfect fourth. And what you'll notice is that you ended on the same note you started on, right? That's true with all of these little rings of hell. So the idea here is that you can start anywhere on any pitch, you can start anywhere on any circle, and you can go any direction on any circle. And you can gauge whether or not you're correct by whether or not you get back to the same note you started on at the end. If you don't get back to the same note you started on, you made a mistake somewhere, right? So it's not only beneficial for you to learn to measure intervals from a specific place, like you're on A flat, you have to go up a major sixth, right? So, what's a major sixth above A flat? Maybe that's an interval you haven't thought of as much as the other intervals, right? Real quick, what is up a major sixth from A flat, everybody? F, cool. See, I had a feeling that like most of the people in here would already have all this stuff. So use this. If this is something that you could do on your instrument quite easily, if you feel like, oh, I could pull this off on my instrument, no problem. Then the next thing to do is sing these. And I highly recommend doing that. So just give yourself the first note, call it do if you need to, or whatever, and use these as ear training to try to sing around the circle and see if you can arrive back at the same note you started on in tune. That's what they were developed for, that's like the purpose for them, but I found them to be highly useful for my private students who are learning intervals, right? It's just a great resource because it's somewhat random, but not completely. Cool. So after intervals, the next thing I recommend digging into is something that may, again, be super simple for a lot of the students in here, but I think is super essential. After intervals, you're going to want to get into triads. Who can tell me what a triad is?
I mean, it could be 3 notes. It's a chord made up of 3 notes. Or a 1, a 3, and a 5. It doesn't have to. Yes.
All right, sweet. So it's funny, the triad has actually a super specific definition. It really does, because you can't just say that a chord with 3 notes is a triad, right? And you can't just say that a chord that is built by skipping letter names, C, E, G, D, F, A, so on and so forth. You can't just say that those are triads either, because there are specific sizes and types of triads that make it, quote, qualify as a triad, which can be extraordinarily confusing in the beginning. It really can be, right? However, how many people in here, just at show of hands, not to like one-up each other or anything, but how many people in here already have all of their triads completely memorized? Sweet. How many people in here, when I said triad, were like, huh, I've never really heard of a triad before? Exactly. So everyone's somewhere in the middle, right? Everyone has, like, you can play a B flat major triad just fine, but how about like a F sharp augmented triad, right? Maybe not quite as quickly. So the idea being that if you are still at the point where all of your triads are not completely solid. If you can't pick up your instrument and just play it, boom, or we only have 5 minutes left now. It's going so quickly. The points I'm trying to make are like gonna get lost, but I'll try to make this one at the end. Rather than, if you can't pick up your instrument and play all of the triads, and if we say that there are 4 types, 12 possible roots, that's 48 triads total, right? And we can talk about inversions as well, but for now it's just knowing the notes in the chord. If you can't do that, practice that. Just practice doing that. Use Random Roots app, right? Or musictheory.net. Or what I like to have my students do is take a song that you're working on. So let's say you're working on, my combos are working on How High the Moon right now. So you're working on How High the Moon. If you were to get the Jamie Aebersold version of How High the Moon, don't laugh when I say Jamie Aebersold. If you were to get the Jamie Aebersold version of How High the Moon, what you would be presented with would be all of the chords to the song, and every chord would have a scale associated with it, a 7-note scale. That's 7 notes a measure. Sometimes 14 notes in a measure that you are expected to think about and process and somehow be creative with while the music's going by at 200 beats per minute. That's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. And I'm sure you can all agree with me that there have been times when you've been, someone says, oh, take a solo on this. And you're looking at the changes, and you're like, gee, right? I mean, I think maybe it doesn't happen now, but I know for me it happened when I was starting out. So what I recommend is instead of going with all these scales or trying to think of all these groups of notes, just start by playing the basic root triad of all the chords in the tune, right? And what that means for us is that we basically end up having like 3, 4 possible options for each chord. If the chord is major or dominant, we'll use a major triad. If that's a major third, we'll use a major triad. If it's a minor chord, we'll use a minor triad. This is 3 notes per chord. And for a lot of us, like, again, show of hands, if I asked you guys to do that over like Autumn Leaves right now, how many people would feel pretty confident just playing triads on Autumn Leaves? Perfect. Everyone should do that then. So what I'm saying is don't worry about the F minor 9, 13, whatever. Don't even worry about that. Just learn to play the root, the third, and the fifth of a given chord first, before anything else, right? Because if you can't do that, then you're doing what Bill Evans totally warns jazz musicians not to do. Again, you can see this on YouTube. You can see everything on YouTube. But there's this really famous Bill Evans, I should have written down the actual quote, but basically what he says is this. The problem with young jazz musicians is that they try to play what they think jazz sounds like. They like listen to it and they hear all these fast notes and these runs and these triplets, and then they pick up their instrument and they just start playing fast notes and runs and triplets. And what they're not doing is playing the harmony. What they're not doing is playing the song, right? They're not playing just what is essential, what the song actually is, right? And it's totally understandable. I mean, I was the same way. I play electric bass, for God's sakes. I mean, nobody laughed at that. Jake's kind of laughing, but basically what I'm getting at is like, I play an instrument that his whole legacy is just playing fast BS, right? So I'm fully aware, like, this is a problem. So when you break it down to just those triads and you can get to just those core notes, you're really getting at the essence of the music, more so than, I mean, there are tons of ways to approach improvisation, but if you can't already do that, I think that would be the very first thing to do. But one thing I have my ensembles do on a regular basis, sometimes they get annoyed with me because they're like, this is so easy, and then they screw it up. They just completely screw it up. Is simply doing this, simply playing through a tune, counting it off, and every time a chord changes, just play root third. Root third, root third, root third, root third, and do it until you can do it in time and well. And then go root third, fifth, root third, fifth, root third, fifth, root third, fifth, and break it into something that's manageable. Cool? So that's my little rant about triads. If you want to know more about triads, What do? Just Google it, or ask your teacher, really, ask your teacher. But private lessons are 1 hour, right? How much time do you spend on the internet?
A lot.
Exactly. So, I mean, get off Netflix and get on to musictheory.net, and you'll think of it. Okay. After triads, we get to 7th chords. That's all. This has been lectured at you your entire time playing music. So I'm gonna throw some chords, right? Meaning that that's what all the chords are in the music you play. So you're really used to seeing A minor 7, D7, G major 7, all that stuff. Make sure that you can measure your intervals, that you can play your basic triads. Adding the 7s will take you a while, but make sure you can do these before you go here. After that, 9ths, 11ths, 13ths, and alterations. So this would be like the higher order numbers of the chord suffixes. One thing that will happen, and I don't want to disparage Jamie Aebersold at all when I say this, but one thing that will happen is if you follow this progression, intervals, triads, 7ths, and then start getting into your 9ths, 11ths, and 13ths, by the time you get here, then if all of this stuff is combined, then the whole idea of chords and scales going together, like this scale goes with this chord. Have you guys ever talked about that with your teachers before, the idea of scales going with chords? Yeah. Once you get here, you already have the scale, because the 7th chord with all the extensions is the scale, right? So you're already there. You don't really have to go an extra step to add scales. I personally cannot stand chord scale theory as a method of teaching improvisation. That's just me. I just think it's like not good. However, and there were 2 more points I wanted to make, and I'm going to make them. Okay?
Good. Make
The first one is this. There are certain situations where chord scale theory is awesome. These situations are when the music you're playing has long stretches of one chord and the music is not tonal, meaning it's not in a key at all. So for example, if I was playing the tune Inner Urge. You guys know the tune Inner Urge by Joe Henderson, right? This is like 4 measures of major 7 sharp 11 chords alternating chromatically. Tune like that, I would probably use chord scale theory because, well, it's just one chord for a long time and it's quite kind of fun. It's just kind of more enjoyable to think that way for me. Other than that, I'll pretty much never use it. What I usually tell my students in my classes is this: if the music is tonal, meaning it's in a key, then scales are not your friend. So that's the one point I wanted to make, which is I hate chord scale theory, but at the same time, there are situations where it's cool. Right? The second point I wanted to make, which was actually the whole point that I wanted to make with this lecture, I'm not sure that I've done it at all yet, so I'm just going to forcefully just like tell you the point I'm trying to make is this. Music theory is kind of an intellectual endeavor. Would you guys agree with that? It doesn't, I mean, it's obviously, the idea is that you're supposed to learn it and listen so that as you're learning it, you're also learning what everything sounds like. But that's often not practical in terms of the methodology, like the pedagogy, how it's taught, things like that. So it's sort of this intellectual endeavor. And playing music expressively with people in real time, I don't want to say it's not an intellectual endeavor, but it's much more than that. So if your expectation is, I will learn how to spell these things, I will learn how to figure out what notes are in these things, I will learn the concepts, and then that's good enough, I'm now going to go and I'm going to perform because intellectually I know what these things are, it just won't happen for you. It just won't. You won't have enough time in the moment to look at the chord symbol, think about all the stuff that you've learned and then implement it in a musical way. It just won't happen. So the thing to do here with all of this stuff is very analogous to how you learn to play really basic rock guitar. It's like the same concept, which is you learn intellectually how to play a C chord on the guitar. And then you try to play a C chord on the guitar. And you realize that playing a C chord on the guitar is actually not easy. Like figuring out how to play a C chord is really easy. But playing it and making it sound good is not. And there's actually only one way. One way. There's only one way for you to be able to play a C chord on the guitar and have it sound good consistently. And that one way is doing it